What do you see as some of the main continuities and discontinuities inherited from these times, looking back from 2012?
It's really informative to read some of the better summaries of research in English and literacy education from 1972 to get a sense of the perennial things that still concern us and preoccupy us, and should. Samuels's list from the Reading Research Quarterly is informative in that regard. I think it points to a lot of thoughtful ways in which we can think about the continuities that challenge us in this profession. The first thing he talks about as a real issue is the danger in English and literacy education of thinking that once you've labelled a kid in some way or another, that you've actually got an explanation that's going to help you in teaching that kid better. This kind of constant notion that we can, as in his words, we can delude ourselves into thinking we've explained something by putting this label on this kid. And it might be to do with some sort of special needs that kid might have, like the kid might be a dyslexic, we might think this child could be dyslexic or have learning difficulties of this, that and the other way. And the field's preoccupation with refinement in those labels. And he says there's a real danger that we continue to think that we're getting better at understanding something in a way that's actionable pedagogically. And he said, and basically it's not. And the same kind of labelling can apply from some of the sociological or demographic things that we find, people wanting to explain things in these sorts of ways. A second issue that he talks about is the notion that, the hunt for what works, the notion of single best practice, the one thing that will work best for all. And we know that clearly some things work better than others, but we also know that the clientele is not just diverse, but the clientele is diverse in changing ways. Since 1972, if you think of the demographic changes in this country, which now lead it to be one of the most multicultural and multilingual nations in the world, and the changes that have occurred since then, since 1972, the different kinds of kids that are in our classrooms, then you really get a sense that we have to be very circumspect in imagining that there is a single best practice in pedagogy. And I think Peter has been a good force for continuing to churn that and to make us realise that these are changing targets that we're looking at here. We've got to be very receptive, as Catherine Snow said, from summarising her massive review of the literature, that what we know is that there is good teachers have a toolkit and they know what to use in responsive ways to particular kids, and that this is not a simple or easy kind of task, that teaching a child to read in contemporary cultural and linguistic and educational circumstances is not a straightforward thing to do. A third point that Samuels makes is to do with assessment, and in those days he complained about an over-reliance on IQ testing as a way of somehow explaining something to do with, oh well, this child's struggling to read and here's why. So another form of labelling, but a real excessive reliance on a simplistic interpretation of testing. And it seems to me this still dogs our profession, that we either dismiss certain forms of assessment or we wholeheartedly over-invest in them. We over-endow them with some sort of informativeness that they can help change our practice, and we can get to that new horizon. And we, I think, still struggle to have a nuanced and sophisticated notion of how we can draw in a professional way on assessment rather than simply resisting it or rather than over-investing in it. That was a problem that Samuels identified in 1972, and it's still, in particular in the ways in which we relate to policy, to politicians and to the media as a profession, that's something that is a significant issue. And a fourth thing that he complains about a little bit is the fragmented and bitsy nature of the research that informs our profession in people who are interested in the teaching of English language and literacy to primary kids. That there is a lot of research, actually. There are hundreds of studies, particularly in early reading acquisition. But the big questions that we want to ask, the big assumptions, the big quest that we have when we turn to research almost always involves, with children, almost always involves something to do with the long term. Not just can I fix this and have it look better for next week, but what will be the consequences of this for next month and next year? And longitudinal, consistent, theoretically coherent longitudinal research is so hard to find. And because we have so many hardworking and committed researchers and so many people in the profession do higher degree studies and do research projects, but they're necessarily short-term. So we have a proliferation, and in a kind of theoretical sense, it makes it hard. And again, we run the risk of ghettoising these. Oh, well, you go with this approach or you go with that approach. There's a whole cluster of studies here and another cluster of studies there. So there's something that Samuels complained about and worried about in 1972 that I think, if anything, is something we should be more worried about now. It's a continuity, and I think that the role of Peter in wanting to play in that sort of field should be something that be part of their vision for the future with respect to becoming more involved in the development of coherent longer-term studies of primary English teaching in Australian schools, and to contribute in a patient but in the end very, very valuable way, I think would be a good part of their vision for the next 40 years. When we think about the discontinuities, it seems to me that the major discontinuity is about the sort of intellectual construction of the field and what kinds of ideas and research that we draw upon to inform our teaching now compared to 40 years ago. Growing throughout the late 1960s and the 70s was the reshaping of psychology, particularly educational psychology, into what we now think of as cognitive psychology or cognitive science. An understanding that these things are bound up not just with perceptual processes of recognition or auditory recoding. Those things may be involved, but from an educational point of view, so much more value could be had in reconstruing the issue of literacy as learning with and about texts, and that involves knowledge and knowledge acquisition and a number of those big things that we led to what we now think of as a cognitive science approach. This was punctuated in 1974 by the creation of the Centre for the Study of Reading at the University of Illinois. And along with the Learning Research Development Centre at Pittsburgh, it had a collective effect on the field that I think was quite dramatic in terms of reshaping what psychologists had to say to us. It was led by Professor Richard Anderson, and it involved a lot of work around basically using extended texts of the kind that kids use in school and looking at the ways in which, from the middle primary on, in particular, after the sort of acquisition phases of reading, the centrality of comprehension issues, the ways in which the equity curves come apart dramatically in those middle primary years as the curriculum areas start to be encountered more dramatically as a reading and writing problem. And that was a watershed sort of issue. And that came along out of the interface of psychology with Chomsky and linguistics that was growing then. And what we find from then onwards was a real opening of the field to different sorts of disciplines. We find key texts written by anthropologists such as Brian Street, and critical political scientists and philosophers such as Colin Lancashire, and historians such as Harvey Graff, and so on. And all of a sudden, this field got to be enriched by a lot of different disciplinary approaches that have led us to this point. I think the nice part about that is that a lot of that is reflected in the ways in which the thinking was opened up, and it's evident in Peter's publications and the offerings and the people that began to be involved through that period as well, culminating in the involvement of applied linguists and humanist psychologists and cognitive psychologists, curriculum designers, and so on, all enriching this field way beyond what was around in 1972, so that we now think of these topics in university study, in professional development, and as a base of ideas about practice and about thinking and about learning in school that's informed by a whole range of disciplines, much more complex and sophisticated than was available to educators with our interests 40 years ago.